So the non-sales example, and maybe you've got a family member or a friend who's notorious for it, and you'll recognize this. They like to ask you what's going on in your world, not because they're genuinely interested, but because they want to hear just enough so they can tell you what's going on in their world, right?
Right. How was your weekend? It's all about me telling you about my weekend, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, the sellers do it the same way though. And sometimes I don't think they recognize it. They ask, is there an issue or a challenge that we might be able to talk about? And the prospect says, absolutely, we have this problem. And they go, now the seller goes immediately into my weekend, right? Let me tell you about what we do. Let me tell you about how we've done it for others. And it's this combative listening, right? And what we're not doing is we're not learning and we're not asking good questions. And that's really, again, back to this trust and credibility. Are we being a good partner in the conversation? Or are we trying to dominate it? The last episode that we did, and hopefully everyone had a chance to watch that, but if you did, you understood the buyer-seller dance, this interaction that takes place when salespeople and potential clients meet each other, some of the challenges that pop out of that. And then we kind of want to bring that forward here into really stage one of developing a relationship, which is bonding and rapport. And just a simple thought behind bonding and rapport is, it's about building trust and credibility. I think sometimes it can get misinterpreted as having to have things in common with people, Anthony. And so I'd say, it's a beautiful, heart with wings that you have over your shoulder there. Oh, I've got one too, right? And okay, well, maybe if I have one, right, then we can connect over that, but it's probably not likely that's the case. We don't have to have things in common to have trust and credibility. We just have to have, trust and credibility. And there's a way to develop that where we don't have to have things in common and we can still move forward and have a healthy relationship.
Well, I think sometimes we make this insincere effort to do it, right?
Absolutely.
And it comes off that way. I think on a cellular level, buyers know when you're trying to be, trying to manipulate, right? And that feels manipulative and it feels insincere and it feels like that. I think as we go through this portion of it, you really start to see the science and understand what's happening there and why that happens. I mean, we all kind of get that little spidey sense. All right, this guy's being a little too he's manipulating me, and we've been manipulated before. People have tried to work us, and
Yep.
no one wants to be worked.
Absolutely. And when we know that that's happening, again, go back to the last episode we shot, that's where the buyer system kicks in. When people feel like they're being sold things or they feel like they're being manipulated, they're more likely to put their guard up. And they should, because that's not honest selling. We like to talk about honest selling.
I agree. I think that's it's a great spot, and so let's jump right into it and start to look at how do we bond and maintain rapport as we create this relationship with our potential buyer, right? I mean, and it's essentially what we're doing. This is the courting stage, right? If this was a relationship back in the old days, this might be us sitting in a parlor getting to know each other.
Absolutely. And, today maybe we don't even have enough time to do that, right? Because things are moving at a million miles an hour. So right out of the gates, how do we establish bonding and rapport? Well, the way that we don't do it is, again, by engaging the buyer's system. I already mentioned that a couple of times, but I want to continue to encourage people to think about that. If you engage it, you're going to fight it the whole time. So out of the gates, we want to make sure that we're using some core principles. And we've talked about the science of selling. So I want to think about it from some applications maybe on the science side here today, Anthony.
Yeah.
And there's the art piece is, how you use that to just talk and interact with people, right? That's the art piece on the other side.
Yeah.
So if we look at science, not engaging the buyer system, we want to use pattern interrupts. That's this neuroscience that either engages the buyer system or doesn't. And so pattern interrupts, how we start the dialogue, how we open the conversation, that will start to create this bonding rapport and trust and credibility. So maybe a quick example of what that looks like. Let's say, again, a seller is making an outbound call, an attempt to reach someone. And I reached out to you and maybe I did it this way. I said, hey, Anthony, this is Eric Meyer. I'm calling from Sandler Training. I wanted to talk to you about how we can help increase the sales revenue in your organization. I've done some research on your company, and I was hoping that we could take a couple of minutes. I could share with you how we've worked with other companies in your industry, and we could figure out how we might be able to work together with you and really increase the sales performance of your organization. That might be well-intentioned, but what's the likelihood you're going to engage with me?
None. Even if I'm looking for them,
Yep.
it feels like another sales call, and I'm just there's my buyer's response going back to my I've engaged that system. I've already gone into protective mode.
Yep, absolutely. So the simple concept, there's a million different versions of them. But here's a simple concept, and it might be something like this. I call it to you, Anthony. You pick up, you say, hi, this is Anthony. And I say, hey, Anthony, it's Eric Meyer. And then I just go radio silent, right? And predictably, you do a lot of things. You say, hi. You say, Eric who? You say, how can I help? Right? But you kind of engage back in, right? And I just kind of let that silence give you a chance to respond. And then I'll bail you out. And I say, hey, Anthony, I'm guessing my name doesn't ring a bell.
That's right. That's right.
And then you say, no, it doesn't, right? And now I can move into why I called, but I've broken the pattern of that otherwise very common opening that kicks the buyer system into high gear. So it's a very different approach right out of the gates. It's not natural. People have to learn how to do stuff like that. That's an example of one. But if you think about the science again behind what a pattern interrupt is, think about it like, if you're driving, everyone's got patterns. We've learned how to shortcut our world, right? If we had to overthink everything we did all day, our heads would explode and it wouldn't be good. So we've got these shortcuts, right?
That's right.
So, the first time you had to drive to an office, right, you probably had to plug it into GPS, right? You didn't know where to go. So you plugged it into GPS. It told you where to turn, where to, come off and exit, all that stuff. Now, the 1,000th time you did it, you didn't have to use GPS to do that. You intuitively knew where to go. You also had a sense for where you probably had to slow down, where you had to speed up, where there was going to be traffic. And so maybe now you could pay more attention to listening to a podcast like Future Factory, right? You didn't have to be fully invested in driving at that moment because the patterns had kicked in, right?
That's right.
Now that works, Anthony, until you get to the road you normally turned right on. And, in Michigan, we call it the orange cone season.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
We got two barrels in front of it. There's a detour. So, you're still in control of the car, right? But what's now in control of where the car is going? Well, it's the detour.
That's right.
Because you can't go right anymore. So that's how pattern interrupts work. So the seller who uses them creates the detour to the buyer system. And so the buyer's still in control of their conversation, their thought process, their mindset, but the seller's now moved where that conversation is likely going to progress next. And predictably, if you're doing it right.
That's right. And it stops that pattern interrupt right there. Just that little piece right there. If my judgment is that sellers spend more time identifying how to do that right there on their cold calls, if they're doing a cold call process, or however they're doing that pattern interrupt, that there alone will just increase their sales volume or their opportunity to create an opportunity, just in that one practice alone.
Exponentially, right? And if that first example didn't land well with anyone, here's another one, and there's a million of them. But I might say, I call it to Anthony. He picks up. He says, "Hi, this is Anthony." I go, "Hey, Anthony, it's Eric Meyer. I was looking for a little help, and I wasn't sure if you're the right person to talk to." And then again, I go quiet, right? And predictably, you do a lot of the same things. How can I help? What are you calling about? But you lean back in, and that's the key, right? So we got pattern interrupts maybe as that first stage. Leading with pattern interrupts, don't engage the buyer system. We're way more likely to create bonding and rapport, or at least set the stage for good trust and credibility in this conversation moving forward. Then we've got some other principles, so maybe we can dive into a couple other ones. As that conversation progresses, there's an opportunity now for a good move into being a good partner, let's say, in that conversation, which means that a seller should be intentionally involved in listening. And sometimes that's a huge challenge. Right? A seller gets someone who actually is willing to have a conversation with them. And sometimes the first thing the seller wants to do is begin to educate, talks too much, right? They're trying to move too quickly into getting someone to understand they're an expert, right? And it creates some conflict. So there are 3 different versions of listening that will help increase the level of trust and credibility or decrease it. So the first 2 are likely to increase it. The third one is likely to decrease it. So Anthony, if we thought about the first one, we call it passive listening.
Yep.
At some point in the conversation, every seller is supposed to be passively listening. You ever heard the reference 2 ears, 1 mouth, use appropriately?
It's the toughest thing a sales. Look, I've been in that sales role, and that's when there's a silence in the room.
Yep.
It's tough for a young sales, for me, even for me. I've been doing sales my whole career, and that silence in the room happens. I feel like it's my job to fill it with everything I know. And I want you to know that I know what I'm doing. And before I'm trying to get you as much information before you kick me off the phone.
Absolutely. And so there could be a tendency to maybe overtalk or overshare.
Yeah.
But one of the best ways to listen is to just start with what we call passively listening. Passively listening is where it's not your turn to talk, but you want to make sure that people know you're engaged. So, on a phone call, it's a little difficult to passively listen, although sometimes silence is just your friend. That's all you're doing. But if you said maybe it's an environment like Zoom or Teams, or something like we're on right now, you're passively listening well at the moment by using body language. You're not
That's right.
saying anything, but you're nodding, right? There's
Right.
confirmation in there, right?
Yep.
And if we don't do that on average, how long it takes before you can passively listen and not check out of the conversation?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very short window, right? And
Very short.
yeah, and so a seller starts thinking like, what am I going to say next? Where do I want to take the conversation? They might be missing what's being shared completely. So we
Yeah.
want to make sure that with passive listening, we're using good physiology and body language.
So let's go back a little bit. So,
Yep.
what happens when I get on that first call, when I get on the call, or I watch others get on the calls, you start the conversation, and a lot of times I did look, I equate the whole sales process to my old dating process, right? The
Mhm.
walk across the room at a bar, right? I got to walk up, I got to come up with a one liner. I got to say something that interrupts what was different than all the other guys who walked up to the a girl I was trying to meet.
Yep.
And I'm sorry if I don't mean to be offensive to anybody that's out there, but I oftentimes think of the process like that when I'm calling a potential buyer, and I'm trying to get to, they got their day going. I'm just trying to find a way that I can get into a window where I can have a conversation. That first section for me is all about just getting to being able to have the next conversation. I'm not
Yep.
trying to sell them necessarily at that point. I just want to be able to, get there so I can sit down and if it go back to Danny, I just want to be able to buy him a drink, right?
Yeah.
And then while that's happening, then I'll have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what's happening. But I'm looking for the permission to be there, right? Just to get into the space.
Absolutely. Can we get them to pause in their busy day long enough to have at least a brief interaction conversation where you can have some honest dialogue about whether we want to take it further, right?
Right. And I think that's a lot of times we try to go right for the sale, and it's nonsense because there's not one of us that are in business today that doesn't have 1,000 things coming at me. I mean,
Yep.
if you go to my office in a given day, there's people lined up like a landing field of O'Hare outside my door, and then there's people, things on my to-do list that need to get done, and I'm in a constant pattern of never having enough time to kind of get there. And then you got this person who wants to get a sales call and talk to me. I just had a guy I was talking about this in the last show about this insurance company. And
Yep.
this guy was a great idea, but I couldn't. He kept calling me, and I couldn't stop to, even if I wanted to, I couldn't do in the moment, right?
Yep.
And it was just it was tough for me, but he was continuing. He kept doing it, kept trying, and then one day he showed up at my office and brought me this big old gift basket,
Yeah.
right? It had a book and a bottle of wine and things, even though I don't drink, and had all this other, but he knew I read. It had all this great stuff in there, that was fun. And that was my pattern interrupt, right? Because then I kind of felt like I owed him some time, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
It was more than I expected. It was way more than I expected. It was actually this nice gesture. It had, took the basket out and I gave it to people in the office, the office personnel, and it felt, and he wrote a handwritten letter, right? The handwritten letter was really beautifully said. Hey, I know you're busy. I know it takes time. I know that we connected on an idea here. I think this would be an interesting one for us to talk about. How do how do we get that time together?
Mhm.
And like all of a sudden, I called him, got him on the phone with the VP, and the two of us set up time for him to come in and do the whole thing. We really, it really caused that to happen. I actually felt obligated then to spend time with him, even though I was busy. Like, I don't know, it's kind of right. That feeling of like, I felt I was busy. So, but I felt like he really did go above and beyond to spend the time to get into my day. And at the end of the day, it was really what I needed. I needed to look at it, and we're still negotiating with him to put some a whole nother practice of insurance together. We'll give our people more insurance and at a lower cost and better quality insurance. And I thought to myself, of course, that's what I wanted to do. I just couldn't stop and understand it at the time.
Absolutely. So he had to break the pattern, right?
That's right.
And that gives the opportunity to have that conversation. And I love what you shared there too, is you guys haven't decided to work together or not. So I just want to make sure everyone listening knows using pattern interrupts does not guarantee you get the deal,
That's right.
but it's more likely to guarantee that you get a chance to have the conversation. And
That's
that's maybe the most important part out of the gates. So we've got this passive listening stuff that's good physiology, paying attention there. Then active listening, right? Active listening would be where you participate in the conversation, but you do it through good listening. So as you're hearing things that are being shared, you want to make sure that they've been heard and understood, because more than anything, that's what people want, Anthony, is to be validated, right?
That's right.
So
Well, you hear me. You hear what I need.
absolutely. And so active listening is a chance to do that. You just kind of share back important points of the conversation, maybe things that have been shared with you, read them back, make sure you took notes down that were accurate. And so that's kind of active listening. I do want to be on the lookout for combative listening. Maybe we can share this with everyone. And combative listening can be a real death march. People have a tendency to do it without realizing they're doing it. So I'll give you maybe like a non-sales example, and then we can bring it back to a sales example. So the non-sales example, and maybe you've got a family member or a friend who's notorious for it, and you'll recognize this. They like to ask you what's going on in your world, not because they're genuinely interested, but because they want to hear just enough so they can tell you what's going on in their world, right?
Right,
So,
right. How was your weekend? It's all about me telling you about my weekend, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the sellers do it the same way though. And sometimes I don't think they recognize it. They ask, is there an issue or a challenge that we might be able to talk about? And the prospect says, absolutely, we have this problem. And now the seller goes immediately into my weekend, right? Let me tell you about what we do. Let me tell you about how we've done it for others. And it's this combative listening, right? And what we're not doing is we're not learning, and we're not asking good questions. And that's really, again, back to this trust and credibility. Are we being a good partner in the conversation? Or are we trying to dominate it?
It's right. And it comes off very quickly as a trap, right? You just made a trap. You kind of put me in a trap, and then you're like, oh, he didn't really, it was, so how do you make that step, right? As you're going down the path, right?
Yep.
And you're starting to relate to them, you're doing all the right things. You're actively listening. I'm listening. Got it. Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about how that works for you. And then how are you bringing in, right? Where's that shift that goes from, I want to really identify that I've got a solution for you, and do that in a way that doesn't sound insincere. Like where's that little shift that takes place?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're thinking about like early on in a conversation, trying to understand, are there pains, we would call them pains, of course, in Sandler, that we might be able to address as a seller in the conversation. And you've got that active listening, passive listening, you're understanding what's going on in their world and making the shift. And we'll talk about this one much more in depth on another conversation we're going to have, Anthony, is what we call an upfront contract.
Okay.
And an upfront contract really does close out bonding and rapport. And that's where we kind of make the move now from saying, hey, I think we understand what's going on in your world. Let me make a recommendation. Right? Why don't we find some time to get together, talk about this further? I just caught you in the middle of your day. You probably need a good hour. Let's find time in the calendar that works both, for both of us in the next week or two. And so we want to make this shift now and move that conversation forward. But after we've understood, or after we've heard and listened to what's really going on in their world. Not by combatively listening, but by being intentional with passive listening, being intentional with active listening. And again, that trust and credibility really goes back to being heard and understood. So if we're telling, we're not selling. I think that's always an important thing for sellers to be thinking about. Telling is not selling. You can talk yourself out of a deal. It's hard to listen your way out of one, right? And good.
So let's say that again, because I want to speed over that.
Yeah.
So you can talk your way out of a deal.
Yes.
But you can't listen your way out of a deal.
It's much more difficult.
It's hard to listen your way out of a deal.
Yeah,
so
it's much more difficult. Yep. Well, people like to buy things, Anthony. I think that's always, it's important. We can forget that, right? I think as sellers, sometimes there's so much pressure that there's a forceful conversation being directed on someone else. But people with problems like to buy solutions to the problems. That's a healthy journey, right?
That's right. I'm looking to make my company smarter,
Yep.
right? I mean, and we're talking B2B here. This isn't a relationship, but we're talking B2B. Yep. Like I'm trying to find ways to make my organization a smarter organization.
Absolutely. But what you don't like, and what most people would agree they don't like, is feeling like they're being sold something. When that happens, then we just naturally push back, as we should, because it's not obvious that it's in our best interest as buyers when we're being sold stuff. But certainly if there are problems that we're dealing with, and in my business, similar to yours, Anthony, I'm trying to figure out how to bring in resources that are going to elevate our performance, elevate our company, elevate what we can do for our clients. I love buying things that solve problems, but I will push back hard, just like everyone else will, when people try to sell me stuff, because it's not in my best interest. The conversation's one way, and it's a little self-serving, not to our organization, but maybe to their commission.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So we want to make sure, again, that we're having good dialogue, opening that conversation, approaching it appropriately. And we've got some other, maybe tools, we can say, for the toolkit, and we're trying to develop this bonding and rapport. So we talked a little bit about listening. We talked a little bit about pattern interrupts. I want to give two more tools here for today, and maybe we've got some time. We can dig into a third. But maybe another one to think about is these principles of what's called okay, not okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. there's, there's always this kind of jockeying position of what we call okayness. And you can think about okayness. Everyone wakes up in the morning with an okayness pond, right? It's not like a spring-fed lake. It's a pond, right? So it's got just about as much water as it's going to have in the morning. Now, as the sun rises and it comes across and the water begins to evaporate, that water will leak out of the pond. And at the end of the day, we've got less okayness on average than how we started. And it's a challenge. Everyone wants to be okay, which is to be comfortable in their skin and happy with who they are. But if we go about our day, often, especially if we're in sales, we're going to hit objections, roadblocks, pushback, challenges, problems we've got to solve and fix. And every one of those kind of chips away at the okayness of an individual. A good way to look at this too, by the way, is that people have a tendency to try to get their okayness needs met, not by doing it for themselves, but doing it at the expense of others. And so if you thought about maybe social media as a quick example, right? No one wants to admit it, but likely this is happening at least somewhere behind the scenes.
That's right.
Right. They are scrolling through the feed, not to celebrate the success of everyone that, is showing up, but to maybe judge where their life is at against someone else's. And if they can find someone they're doing a little better than, they feel a little better for the moment. Right. So it's a chance to get the okayness, Matt. Right.
Hey, for sure that happens. I was on Facebook the other day watching one of my cousins. I was like, man, I'm not traveling enough. I got to get out there and move. She was at a concert. Another one, her and her husband have been traveling everywhere. I'm like, I gotta get you up here. I was comparing my life to her life in the moment, and who knows where that's at. But that's what happens in social media, right? It's absolutely a comparative example of how am I living compared to how they're living. Am I okay?
Yes. Am I okay? Right. And if I'm not, I'm going to try to get my okayness back. That's either as a judgment or a decision to do something. And so, when we see kind of prospects and sellers meeting each other in the sales conversation, the principles of okayness start to unfold. So if you can kind of think about it, maybe there's two columns. You got a seller on one side, you got a prospect on another side. And so when they open the conversation, if they're willing to have it with each other, it's a position of okay. Seller's okay, prospect's okay. So it might look something like this. The seller reaches out. They ask if someone's interested in having the conversation. The prospect says, yeah, that's interesting to me. I'd be willing to meet. Both parties are okay there, right? They're comfortable. But as that conversation progresses and it now starts, the seller starts to do that combative listening stuff we were talking about. So they want to exert their position as an expert. They begin to maybe overshare, talk too much, talk about what they want to talk about. And this prospect sitting over here, they've got questions that they want to get answered. They've got information they're trying to obtain, and they're not really getting a chance to do it. So the seller is now exerting their okayness, but the prospect's starting to become a little not okay, right? And just like we talked about before, when people begin to be not okay, they've got to try to figure out how to get okay again. And so often what will happen is the prospect will now try to get their okayness back. So the easiest way to do that in a sales conversation, Anthony, is to throw an objection out. Right. Well, I think that's too expensive, or I don't know that we're ready to do something like that. And, now that seller is going to be not okay because now they're hearing these objections and roadblocks. So they feel a little not okay. Prospects getting okayness because they've regained control of the conversation. Right. And then the seller, from a position of not okay, says, hey, look, I'd like to try to figure this out together with you. Would you be willing to meet again? Right. And so it's kind of a wishy-washy attempt at next steps because they're not okay now, right? And the prospect is already feeling not okay anyway because they don't really want to do it, but they don't want to make the seller feel bad, so they agree to it with no intention of following through. And so now this conversation that started okay leaves not okay for both parties, and nothing positive happens because of it. Both of them leave not okay and feeling worse for the interaction.
So as you go through that, let's go back. Like, how do I? So I notice that happens, right? I can feel that shift, right? All of a sudden, it's I'm not sure, or I think about it. I think we're doing pretty good. Hey, why don't you check in with me next year? Hey, this quarter where I'm kind of booked. Check with me back at the first of the year. I'm going through a tough time. all that to me is all blow off, right? How am I getting just get me off this call. When I get into that space, right now, how do I pull it back and try to bring it back into that try to keep it going back to okay again?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two positions there. The first one, if we can maintain it, is to always have it be okay, okay. And as we're
Before
talking,
you get to the bad spot, try to stay out of that space before you get there, right? That's the
yep.
number one we avoid. Just avoid getting there. Let's talk a little bit. How do you do that?
So you don't do combative listening,
Okay.
right? Because that's a good place to make someone feel not okay.
Yep.
You make sure that you're focused on the passive and the active listening, and you're intentional about what's happening in the conversation. We can shift gears here. And Anthony, I always want to apologize because I'll wander into a million different directions.
Yeah, no, I absolutely.
So let's take it over here to another concept, and this can help with it too, and then I'll tie it back to the rest of okayness principles. So if you could picture a pendulum, right? And a pendulum, maybe it looks like a clock on a wall. So you've got 3 o'clock, and then you've got 9 o'clock, and then you've got 6 o'clock down at the bottom, right? So 3 o'clock, let's say that's yes, right?
Yep.
9 o'clock we'll say is no.
Yep.
6 o'clock would be interest but non-committal.
Okay.
Right? Yep. So prospect at 3 o'clock is like, yes, let's go, we're in. Prospect at 9 o'clock is no, I don't want to do anything, let's stop. Prospect at 6 o'clock is like, hey, I'm kind of interested, but I don't know if I want to have the conversation now or if I want to have it never, right? So the challenge there with okayness is that often when we start this conversation, we're thinking about it through the lens of bonding and rapport. And maybe I could ask you, Anthony, because you'll know the answer to this. Is it fair to say that seller's mindset starts the dialogue from a position of 3 to 6? Right. And prospect's mindset is probably more likely 9 to 6.
That's right. For sure. Right.
Yeah. So out of the gates, right, we've got two very different and diametrically opposed mindsets coming into the conversation. So to protect that okayness, the seller has to be able to come into it from the position of 6 to 9 o'clock, not 3 to 6. Every time the seller gets in front of the prospect in that pendulum swing, that prospect is likely to react like a pendulum would, right? An object in motion stays in motion and an object at rest stays at rest. So if you want the prospect to get to 3, helping them swing their own way to 3 is a healthier journey than trying to drag them to 3. Every time the seller tries to drag them another step through that pendulum, what do?
They bunker in more.
Yeah, they push back. It's a counterforce, right?
That's right.
So, maybe a quick example. Let's say a prospect at 6 o'clock, and I'm talking to them, and they say, "Hey, Eric, I appreciate you reaching out. I don't know if it's the right time for us to meet. This is interesting. Maybe call me in a couple of months." And I say, "Hey, I'm happy to do that. I just want to make sure what I heard you say there is that it's a no. Is that fair?"
Yeah. Right.
Right. And often what they'll do is say, "Well, I don't know if I'd call it a no."
Wow.
Right?
There you go.
And so now I took it to 9 o'clock. Where'd they go? Well, maybe back to like 8. Right. And so they're starting to swing this pendulum, but it's very counterintuitive. We call that negative reverse selling. And, it's not meant to be manipulative. It's meant to be honest. Because as we hear that may be what's really happening. Let's clear the air on it for them. They'll either confirm it in a right way or they'll confirm it in a wrong way, which means we're better off for it. That's the thing with negative reverse selling. You can't be worse off for it. You're either right in a good way or wrong in a better way. If I said, let's just call it a no, if that's what I'm hearing here, and they go, yeah, absolutely, it's a no. Great. Now I know KNOW. That's good information, right? But if they disagree with me and they say, well, I don't know if I call it a no completely, that's good too, right? And so now they're starting to move it back. So if I stay behind my prospect in the pendulum through the course of that conversation, Anthony, I will keep them in an okay position because I won't get in front of them. When I get in front of them, I make them not okay. Does that make sense?
I got it. So you're going down, you're building the conversation, right? You're building on getting to know who they are, what's going on. Yep. Now, oftentimes I feel like you've got this window and I want them to know that we're special, that we're the secret sauce that's going to make their career. Like in my brain, when I'm in that sales mode, I'm always trying to say that, hey, look, if you hire us, we're going to be the secret to your success. Like it's like, I want them to feel like they're getting they're going to hire the secret team that will push them forward. That, finally I found the team that's going to make all my problems go away.
Yep, absolutely. But if we do that before they're willing to take the journey with us, then the pressure's on them, Anthony. Right.
Right. So I think that's that dance of knowing, keeping them okay and going down the path. before you get to the point where you've got ahead of them. And that's why the science of this is so important, right? As a listeners, you guys are listening. This is what's so key about having a trainer that takes you through and understand it. I mean, most of us go through our entrepreneurship and know what we're doing, whatever our product is, or we're selling, or whatever we created and we're putting out there. We know that. Like for me, it's construction. I look, once I get on the construction field with them, I'm the pro. I promise you, you got the pro here. I just need to get from here to be able to work with them, right? And I want them to, I mean, sometimes I want them to know all the people we've worked for. I want to get all the other things out there. I want to talk about all the great programs we've done. And, that's kind of in that dance. I'm trying to get them to paint the picture of what we're doing in that, right? The little bit of keeping them okay as we go back and hearing what they're wanting, and then figuring out how do I communicate that I've got a way of supporting that without going too far. Right?
Absolutely. And asking those questions appropriately to figure out where they're at on the pendulum allows them to continue to be okay. We talked about an example at 9 o'clock, all the way up close to 3 o'clock. It can be just as problematic, Anthony.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've ever seen this before. The prospect's almost at 3 and the seller jumps to 3 and says, great, let's get started. And the prospect goes, well, but I've got a couple of questions before we do that. And now all of a sudden they just went from 4 o'clock back to 5, right? Where if the seller said, do you have any questions we haven't addressed yet? And they say, no, we've got everything covered. And you go, well, what would you like to do next? Now they can say, well, let's get started. They'll move themselves to 3. Again, going back to that earlier conversation, people like to buy things. They just don't like to feel like they're being sold things.
Yeah.
So we can give them the environment to make a decision to buy, and it's been healthy through the journey. That's a great moment for both parties. Where we break these principles, it's where we get into trouble.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Getting to the place where you're seen as, when we go in and we're too, I'm not going to call it slimy or we're pushing this.
Yep.
It feels like when it's con artist kind of companies, when I'm assured of my business and I have tech, I know what we're doing. I don't feel like you have to push it. It's almost like, you'll walk them to you. You just got to get the time with them, right?
Yeah.
I just need to be able to get the time with them to see it. I don't have to necessarily go in there and manipulate the scenario. I just need to find a way to pattern interrupt.
Yep.
Right. Get a minute to build rapport, right? To build that relationship with the customer. So they can, they can, take a minute, and it may not be right when I'm there, right? Hey, let's create another opopportunity or get that big gift basket over to the guy and make it where he wants to talk to me. And then, get into this. And then as I start to communicate, how do I listen in a way that helps guide them over to, staying in the okay zone before not pushing it too fast.
Absolutely. And so if we do that, typically we can keep them in the okay zone the whole time. That would be ideal. Sometimes though, they'll get a little not okay. So the next best position is for the seller to be strategically not okay. Right. And this is a hard one to do.
Okay.
So the seller who can comfortably be strategically not okay understands that by doing that, they'll allow that prospect to retain the okayness. So it's not happening to them. They're leading with it. And maybe another way to think about that is by being vulnerable. This is very difficult, I think, for a lot of sellers to accomplish, because vulnerability and strategically being not okay means it's not about them. Right.
Talk to me about that, because that's a tough one. I've always been taught you got to be the pro, you got to be the shining star. How do you stay vulnerable in that conversation?
Absolutely. I'll give you a real world example. So, I run this business, but I also sell because that's how we get our clients. And I like to use our stuff because then we get to validate it, right? So everyone we work with has gone through the process. We then teach them, which is fun, by the way, too. I love when they learn it and they go, hey, wait a minute, we did that together. That was good, right? So hopefully no one, if they become a client, will ever be offended by that. Usually it's a good moment. But so here was a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago. And it started off with someone saying, Eric, I took this meeting out of obligation. You were referred to me. I don't know that I've got any challenges. I've had a bad experience with sales training in the past. And that was the opening, right?
Bam!
So, yeah, right. So this is going to be great. So I'm thinking of these principles we've been talking about. So I go strategically not okay. And I say, hey, that makes sense. You know what? If I'm hearing you right, I think you've already probably formed an opinion that we don't have to have this conversation. by the way, I'm okay with that. Right. I think maybe the best thing I can do is give you some time back in your day, and that'll be my gift. If you want to just call it no, we can call it no, and we can move on. Right.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That right there is not something that most salespeople. I mean, that's something you have to learn how to do. Because my first instinct would be going to why I try to defend it and why it's valuable, and the other way, right?
Yep.
Laying backwards would not be a natural instinct.
Absolutely. And so now my position's not okay. So this individual felt okay, right? And so by them being okay, they said, "Well, no, I'd be open to hearing what you have to talk about. Let's have the conversation. I've got it booked out in my calendar. I've got the time," and we were able to move it forward from there, right? So, but it's very difficult, Anthony, right? I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. The natural tendency is to want to get in front of them in the pendulum. It's to try to defend your position, convince them they're not thinking about it the right way. And that pendulum just pops back up, and they go further back to 9. They will push back and defend, right?
That's right. You have engaged their buyer's system.
Yep. Yeah, we kicked it right back in, right? So all of these, again, are intended to make that buyer system stay over here. We don't want that to enter the conversation at any point. So it's either okay, or strategically not okay on the seller side to protect the okayness of the buyer side. And again, that can be tough to do, but we understand why. And if we're working those principles, it works in our interest and it works in theirs. And so then maybe there's another concept we can talk about called transactional analysis. Now, this one is very complicated. So I want to try to do my best to simplify it as much as I can. So Anthony, I know you're going to ask great questions because you always do. If you want me to work through this, tell me. I'll work through it.
Go for sure. This is a great one. I know this. I know this practice, and let's get it. Because I think the listener will really get this. If you guys get this, this is really a key scientific portion of the process.
Absolutely. So, if you aligned a definition, let's say transactional analysis would be an interaction between one or more people. When done appropriately, it's got a purposeful beginning, middle, and a healthy outcome.
So this is where my conversation starts, right? Kind of what happens in the conversation, and then the outcome of the conversation.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. And if the ego states are managed appropriately, it will move through that. When they're not managed appropriately, what happens is you get a beginning, but it's followed by an endless middle, and there's an unhealthy outcome, right? And sometimes no outcome. So here's what the ego states look like. And everyone operates from one of the 5 when they're interacting with anyone, right? Sellers interacting with prospects, people interacting with friends, interacting with your kids, whatever it might be, interacting with yourself too. I think that's an important thing we can talk about if we've got time.
Right.
So the ego states look like this. The first one is what's called your nurturing parent ego state. So this nurturing parent ego state, you're not necessarily born with it. You kind of learn it, right? Through observing others. For
sure. You learn it because it's not definitely as kids, we're more self-centered. We don't learn that practice until later on in life.
Yeah. So we kind of watch and we look at mentors and coaches and parents, and we learn our nurturing parent ego state. So the nurturing parent ego state, through a definition, would be helpful, guiding, supportive, thoughtful, sincere, pleasant. Like when we're operating that way, we're in our nurturing parent. Now, the flip side of that, though, Anthony, is what's called the critical parent. So the critical parent ego state is also learned through observation. That one is blunt, demanding, aggressive, overbearing, rude, off-putting, right? Those are kind of some of the descriptions for the critical parent. And so, you can think about my youngest daughter. I remember when she was learning to ride her bike, right? She jumped on there enthusiastically, started kind of cruising around, and she rode out between these 2 parked cars. And she didn't get hit by the car that was coming down the street, but it was pretty close, right? And it kind of knocked her off her bike, scared her a little bit. Now, I could pick my nurturing parent or my critical parent to respond to the interaction. Naturally, which one do you think we do sometimes?
Fear kicks in, and all of a sudden you got this, critical parent, right? You're afraid for your daughter's life, and that scared the bejesus out of me, right?
Absolutely. So you stand over, you point down, right? There's this physiology that goes with the words too. And so our critical parent, I think, has a tendency to come out under pressure, and it's not helpful. Our nurturing parent is more likely to guide the okayness principles appropriately.
Got it.
And then you got the adult ego state. So the adult ego state kind of sits in the middle. This is one you're born with. The adult ego state is just the ones and zeros. It's emotionally detached from the interaction it's in. It's following process. It's click and procedure. It's got no emotional attachment to the interaction. It can just move fluidly through logic, right?
So it's just data. It's so data. But bike, ride, scare, fall? I mean, is it kind of processing that data of the interaction?
Yep. And if I'm using
Okay.
my adult ego state there, I can decide to choose nurturing parent response or
Yeah.
critical parent response, right? And then you've got the child ego states. So on one side, it's the natural child. The natural child you're kind of born with. This is the early stages of any human, right? They're curious,
Yeah.
playful, they
Like,
want to
yeah.
have fun, right?
Yeah.
Lots of why questions, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
And that's great, except it can't really be trusted completely. So it's got to be protected by what becomes the adaptive child ego state. So the adaptive child ego state is well intentioned, but that's where people learn tapes and scripts.
Yep.
And
Yep.
these tapes and scripts typically will create later on in life fear, apprehension, self doubt, worry, concern, cause, all that kind of stuff. And so here's one, just as a quick example for sellers. Many people learn when they were young people, don't talk to strangers, stranger
Yeah.
danger, right? You
Right.
remember
Right.
that one?
That's right.
And
That's right.
Anthony, both of us are far removed from being 4 and 5 years old, but we can still recall that pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
They're buried deep in the recess. So let's say we've got a prospect, and our adaptive child ego state kicks in, and it grabs the tape. Don't talk to strangers. Well, a prospect's a stranger, so maybe that's a hesitation.
That's right.
And then our critical parent ego state comes in and says, if you don't do it, you'll lose your job. Right. So it
Mhm.
makes a demand. And now the adaptive child ego state responds out of fear and picks up the phone and makes the call, but they're still in the adaptive child ego state. So they're already coming from a position of fear and apprehension. That prospect picks up. If we don't use things like good pattern interrupts, they probably respond out of the gates with their critical parent ego state. What do you want? Why are you calling? Right.
So going back, so
Yep.
I wanted to really see this,
Yeah.
right? So this is the science of it, right? You know, sales call, stranger danger, stranger danger, stranger danger, and you've got to be able to go back and pull that back, or you're now engaged the sellers, the buyer's process here, right?
Absolutely. Right. And
Buyer
yeah,
system, yeah,
that critical parent response, we met with the adaptive child. That conversation's not going anywhere. And even worse, maybe the adaptive child decides I've had enough of this. I'm going to grab my critical parent and respond now. And so now that's, critical parent's an argument in every other social setting. So that's not going to work well.
no,
So being able to, learn those ego states, but then learn how to choose which ones you want to use as you approach a conversation and a dialogue, and level setting in the ego state will determine to a large degree the ego state you meet. Right.
that's
And
right.
so maybe a quick example of that. Let's say let's say two people were having a disagreement. They're both in their critical parent ego state, but someone knows transactional analysis. So that person decides this isn't helpful. I'm going to grab my nurturing parent. And so I say, hey, Anthony, I think I understand where you're coming from. And it sounds like the two of us disagree. That's okay, by the way. Right.
Yeah, right.
And as soon as I do that, what happens to the tone of that argument?
Way down,
Way
way
down.
way down.
Right. And then I can grab my adult ego state and say, why don't we do this? Let's sleep on it for the night. Let's come back together on it tomorrow morning. How about 8 o'clock? And we can finish talking through.
Right. We've got to be able to, because even if we bring it down, we've
Yep.
got to be able to get off of the emotional, the interact. So giving that pattern break right there and
Yep.
being able to step back. Absolutely. Yes. Got it.
Yeah. And so now we're using these ego states to move in a healthy way. Again, purposeful beginning, healthy middle, healthy
Yep.
out. Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's transactional analysis. Now there's a big deep dive. We can probably go through that again at another time in one of these conversations. So I'm looking forward to, Anthony.
Yep.
But that's what I wanted to share today with the listening audience and help give them a couple more tools again for that toolbox.
Well, let's go back through that again. Just kind of summarize the whole thing that we went through today.
Yep.
So we let's go. So to walk us right back through that.
So we talked about pattern interrupts.
Yep.
We talked about the principles of okay, not okay.
Yep.
We talked about listening skills, active, passive, and combative.
Yep.
We talked about transactional analysis and how to manage that in the conversation.
And what we got coming up after this, the next series, guys, you're going to love listening to this. This entire process that we go through, Eric and his team, they've changed. I made Fortune 100 companies throughout this world. The practices that Eric and his team do really help you and your organization dynamically change the system by which you sell and the opportunities that you create for your organization. Eric, I am blessed to have you on here. Just doing this with you makes me and my organizations much smarter. And it's a gift to be on here with you every day. And audience, if you've liked what we've got out here, if you're enjoying this whole series, please take a second and like and subscribe right now. It means the world to Eric and I. And I'm going to put all of his contact information, all of the information about Sandler and EAM and all the contact information down below, so that we have a way for them to get contacted. Eric, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to catch up with you?
Yeah, the best way would be to just reach out to our office, 248-688-9805, and connect with us there, 248-688-9805.
Eric, as always, it's awesome to have you on the show. We are so grateful to have it. Audience, please like and subscribe down below, and thanks for listening.
Anthony, always a pleasure. Thank you.